Haunted house experiences. This all took place in the mid-90s in a little town called Ottawa in Kansas. These are all true stories of experiences I had while living in that house. I will describe the layout of the house. From front to back, you walk into the den. Moving forward, you enter the kitchen, with a doorway to your right that leads to a bathroom and a master bedroom. If you continue through the kitchen, it leads to a dining room and living room on the left. If you go through the dining room further to the back of the house, it leads to a doorless room that we used for a computer room, and then 2 more bedrooms in the back. I put all this here because over the years family members switched rooms. The first experience happened not long after moving in. At that time, my mom had started a new relationship, and we moved in with him. His mom also lived there, and she had the master bedroom at the front of the house. My mom and her new boyfriend had the room at the very back of the house, and I was in the room next to them. One night, I heard all my mom's music boxes start playing. She had these painted clowns and such that sat on satin pillows and played music. They weren't creepy to me until this night. Anyways, I hear them all going off, and in my kid mind, I'm just pissed my mom is in there playing when she told me it's bedtime. But they just kept playing, all at the same time. It was years later that she, my mom, finally told me she wasn't playing with them. Experience 2 was probably the scariest experience of my life. I was still in one of the back bedrooms, but by this time, my step-grandma had moved out, so my mom and her boyfriend were in the master bedroom at the front of the house. I was alone in the back. I have siblings, but they were back and forth between my mom and dad, so at this point, I was the only kid there. My mom and I had just come home from Walmart, and she had gotten me The Nightmare Before Christmas on VHS. Yep, showing my age. It was late, so she said I could watch it the next day, so I put it on my dresser and went to bed. It was still wrapped in cellophane and still in the Walmart bag. As I was falling asleep, I heard the plastic of the bag, and even with my nightlight, I couldn't see anything. I was scared though, so I gently tossed my big white cat, Muffin Man, onto the floor at the foot of my bed, in hopes that he would scare whatever it was away. Instead, he took off like a bat out of hell. I kept hearing the plastic and was literally petrified. I couldn't even scream, I was so scared. I eventually woke up, and when I did, the movie was out of the case and on the floor. I simply can't explain how. Experience 3. I had a friend stay over, and this story still gives her chills. She had recently lost her mom in a car accident, and this was another attempt at her sleeping over. She would try, but she missed her mom and just wanted to be with her family. But this time, she stayed the whole night. The experience itself wasn't scary for me, but I had a poster of the Crow. It was my first poster ever, and I loved it. But when I woke up, it was tacked upside down. I wouldn't have done that to Brandon Lee, and when my friend saw, she turned white and never spent the night again. So, I know it wasn't her. At that time, my little brother was living with us again, but there's no way he could have reached the tacks at the top of the poster. My 4th experience was probably the second scariest. We had cats. Muffin Man still loved me, LOL. But one day, in the middle of the day, my brother was down the street playing football at the school, and I was home alone with my mom. I was in the computer room, and she was in the kitchen. The day before, my little brother had been pretending he had caught an alien. He had a huge plaster ET piggy bank that was probably 1.52 FT tall. It was ridiculous, really, LOL, but he had a rope tied around it because he had caught it, you know? So I'm at the computer, and all of a sudden, I hear a loud crash from the rooms in the back, and here comes my cat, Jara, with the other end of the rope tied around her tail. Mind you, Jara was a tortie. They're kind of known for just being all around crazy, but for anything to keep that cat still long enough to tie something around her tail is kind of mind-boggling, but something did, and broke off E.T.'s head in the process. I can't explain any of these experiences. My mom ended up having a priest come in and bless our home. He stole my stone collection and dream catcher. Still pissed about that. But we did a little research and found that the property had burned down. I can't remember the dates now, but I don't think the spirit was demonic. I think it was a little girl named Margaret. Curious what everyone else thinks. I'll do a little digging and see if I can find any info about the fire. My experiences in the paranormal, I would say I am very aware of the paranormal and things of that nature. My parents' house, it's over 100 years old, and it's next to the Catholic church where my mom, brother, and I were baptized at. Now this is where it gets interesting. In the 1950s, during the middle of a sermon, the priest who was living in the house attached to the church, he was having a heart attack or something of that nature. The people living in the house at the time, they brought him to their bedroom, what is now our living room, where he later died. Years later, when I was about 8 or 9, I had just woken up from a nap on our recliner in our living room, and I was still groggy. I remember Mom had a plant in the middle of the doorway for some reason, and as I turned my head to see where I was going when trying to not bump into the plant, for 2 seconds, I saw a man without a face but wearing a hat. IDK if it was a trucker or baseball cap, but it was a hat, maybe 3 feet in front of me. The only reason I know it was real is because a year later or so, I was watching TV in Mom's room, and I was about to get up to go to the bathroom, and when I looked at the door, I saw the same guy standing there for a couple of seconds, and then he was gone. I've heard things too, but nothing was as creepy as those experiences, besides hearing my mom's voice twice. Once when she was at work, I heard her call my name from the dryer room downstairs, and I asked Dad if Mom was home, and he said no. The other time, my mom, Dad, and I were all home, and I heard her call my name from the top floor. But it didn't feel right. I didn't respond for a couple of minutes, because it felt off, and I know never to respond if it doesn't feel right. I asked Mom if she called my name a few minutes ago, and she said no. Those aren't even the weirdest things that happened. I have a long-distance girlfriend. Her and I talked on the phone every single day for just a little over a year before we physically met. She'd always tell me about how she'd always see the previous owner walking around the house, who died naturally on the patio, but she never once described what he looked like. The day happens where we finally meet wonderfully, and everything goes normal, until I wake up at about 3-ish in the morning to take a piss. She's still asleep, and I get up and walk past the closet next to the bathroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a guy with glasses wearing a blue flannel but didn't see any legs. It took me a second to register what I just saw, and I looked where I saw him, and he was gone. I take my piss, not really worried about it, go back to the room and asked my girlfriend, "So you know the guy? Does he wear glasses and a blue flannel?" She said, "Yeah, why?" I said, "Well, I just fucking saw him." That still gives me chills to this day, almost 3 years later. Last summer, I even asked her if she ever saw him near me. She said she saw him standing behind me as we were cooking, and that gave me even more chills. This was the first time since high school that I had seen anything, and it's also the last time currently that I've seen anything. I don't know what it is because I'm not religious anymore, more agnostic, and this shit creeps me out and fascinates me at the same time. My grandfather's exorcism experience. A bit of background. My grandfather passed away back in 2013 from cancer, but in his lifetime, he was a decent guy who helped a lot of people in various ways. After he met my grandmother, they both joined the Army. They served in Japanese-based U.S. Army hospitals during the Vietnam conflict, helping to save a lot of guys. After his time with the Army, he joined the Air Force for a stint. This all helped him to get his nursing degree and become an esthetician. After the Air Force, he became a clergyman at their church, and years later, he would become a Russian Orthodox priest. For over 40 years, he served as a priest. BTW, just for reference, in most sects of Orthodox Christianity, they allow clergy to marry unless they were a bishop or higher. My grandfather was the sort of priest that the archdiocese would call up and say, "Father, we have these people in Alabama. They're believers, but they have no church in 100 miles they can attend. Will you go there and help organize something?" Then, What would start as people holding liturgy in someone's living room with 24 people would become a full-on church. He repeated that more times than I've ever gotten a straight answer on. The only thing I thought he was an ass for was always putting the church before his wife and 3 kids. Anyway, it was the mid-70s, and my grandfather had moved my mom, my aunt, and my grandmother to New Jersey to help one of these struggling churches that were without a priest. My mom was about 5 or 6, and she remembers this point in time pretty well. One day my grandfather was contacted by his bishop, who told him that his assistance was needed with something very serious. He told my grandfather that there is this young girl, 17 years old, she is a gypsy, and her family brought her to the monastery claiming that she is possessed. The monks there tell me they believe this to be serious. Will you go there to help them? My grandfather had been a priest for several years by that point, but understand that most priests who serve their entire lives are never asked to help exorcise a demon. Actually, the Roman Catholics require special permission from the Vatican to perform any exorcism rites. He agreed without knowing what he was walking into. The story I was told about the girl was that her name was Juliana, and her family were gypsies, travelers. She had come from a family that was heavily involved in occult practices, which shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with that culture. Juliana was married to a man from another family in their clan. I don't know much about him besides that he was a bit older than her and he also practiced a lot of magic. Juliana's family started becoming concerned when she started acting different. She was very moody, aggressive, wrathful, and just straight up mean. As time went on, her fits would get worse, and she would scream hurtful things at people for being asked simple questions. But the family was terrified when the caravan they lived in would rattle, rise up off the ground a few feet, and drop to the ground, and even on many occasions, seeing things fly off the wall or out of cupboards and break against the wall. They tried their own rites and rituals to cleanse whatever darkness they believed was possessing Juliana, but nothing had worked. So they went to this monastery, desperately seeking help. This is where Grandpa gets involved. He said, when he got there, everyone was in the church. Another priest and a handful of monks, all preparing holy water, oils, saying prayers for help with the God's strength. In the back of the church were several curious lay people that live and help work on the monastery grounds. Then a bunch of Juliana's family. I guess they had her in a room with a few family members till they were ready. They bring her in, sit her on a chair in front of the altar. My grandfather said that he felt the air get thicker and she seemed pissed and was just talking shit, laughing, spitting, trying to scratch and kick. They had a few people restraining her as she started getting violent. They semi-surrounded her, and they began praying and performing the full-on exorcism rite. As the progressed, she began growling, and he said, things started happening. The chairs in the church began rattling, shaking, then moving on their own before levitating off the floor. Those curious people and even some of Juliana's family were so scared that they ran out of the church. He told it they continued praying and repeating the prayers over and over for several hours as things continued to erratically move on their own, and Juliana continued to curse them and their God, spit, scratch, and target each person, and try to get in their head and break their concentration. But they continued, and praying and asking God and every saint they could think of to help them banish this thing back where it came from and to leave this girl. Then she suddenly sat back rigidly and swung her head back. Then her face began to contort and take on this inhuman shape, while her mouth opened wider than a human's mouth can expand without completely separating the jawbone. And without her mouth moving, a voice came from within her, and in this deep, growly, loud, demonic voice said, "Leave me alone. I am happy with her." But this voice didn't speak in English or any other commonly spoken language. It spoke in a dead language that is native to the region of Romania and the steppes of Russia, the Slavonic language. The monks especially knew this language because many old church manuscripts are written in this nearly ancient language. This moment frightened everyone in the room, but they knew they couldn't stop now. Not long after, Juliana passed out. She was unconscious, and they couldn't wake her. She was breathing, but she was in rough shape. So, they brought her to the hospital. She was stable but wouldn't wake up. She slept for about 2 weeks. Then she woke up one day. She was so confused. She didn't understand why she was in the hospital. She had no memory of the exorcism at all. In fact, she couldn't remember the last year and a half of her life. The very last thing she could remember was being in her trailer. She said, "I was sitting at the table while my husband slept in our bed, when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. I turned and I see my husband sleeping on his back, but there was this black cloud that was flowing out of his mouth and hovering above him in bed. Before I could scream, this black cloud rushed at me. Now I'm here." My grandfather was changed forever after that night. My mom tells me that she was 7 or so at the time, and she remembers that her father didn't speak for at least a couple of weeks, and he wore this somber look on his face. He would move on, but it had a lasting impression. My mom says he didn't tell her the story until she was a teenager, and he was trying to warn her off of dabbling in the occult, as you never know what you're inviting in. My grandfather wasn't the kind of guy that liked to make up stories. Actually, he liked to call people out for embellishment. He usually didn't have a lot to say unless you asked him about something. He was very intelligent and read a lot. He also traveled across the U.S. and had been to various countries over his lifetime. He served in 2 branches of the military and had a career as a medical professional. I'd say he has some level of credibility.